Hello, this is April San Miguel, and I am sitting here with Patti Carnes doing an interview about the pandemic and her thoughts about it. And here we go. Hello, Patti. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Yeah, so we just went through the pandemic. How has the pandemic personally affected you in your daily life?
Well, for one thing, we still avoid going out in crowds, and we limit our shopping to weekdays, never go on a weekend, but we choose weekdays and when the stores are less crowded. And still try to keep our distance from people and places. Doctor's appointments, I schedule for right after lunch or right before lunch usually, so that there's not as many people there. And basically, we're a lot more isolated from people than we used to be.
So, what were some of the initial challenges you faced when the pandemic started?
Well, for one thing, I'm immunocompromised, so it was pretty scary, and the challenges were just figuring out how to get things done, how to get the supplies we needed, because it was hard getting things like your toilet paper, and even the flour on the shelves was disappearing. We stocked up on a lot more groceries so that we had stores in the house so we wouldn't have to go out as much. We used to go to the grocery store 2 to 3 times a week. We limited it to 1 day a week. And because I was immunocompromised, my husband went out and bought the groceries most of the time. And I stopped going to church, of course, but the church ended up closing down services, so
Now, I know the pandemic affected so many people in so many ways. Can you describe any significant changes in your mental health and well-being during the pandemic?
well, probably not really, because my husband and I retired just as the pandemic began. So everything was new to us anyway. We stayed at home a lot, but we both have hobbies, so we concentrated on those hobbies. And other than the change in our socializing, and we stopped having company over, and just the basic changes from being retired and working ourselves into a new lifestyle anyway, it was all kind of crunched into one.
Right. So you said you stayed at home a lot before anyway, but how did the pandemic affect your relationships as far as family and friends go?
Well, we stopped inviting the kids over because they wouldn't get their vaccines, for one. And we stopped having family gatherings. We stopped having people over for. My husband likes to barbecue a lot. We stopped having barbecues that involved other people. It became kind of a capsule where he and I were living and trying to maintain a somewhat normal lifestyle, but without all the people.
So you described that you had personal hobbies and that you did during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. What were some of your favorite hobbies?
Oh, I love diamond painting. I love painting. I love reading. I love any kind of needlework or sewing, knitting, anything. There has never been a craft that I didn't love. So my problem is that I have too many things to do and not enough time to do them.
Well, that would significantly help during an isolated event such as the pandemic.
You would think so, but not really. There's still a house to be cleaned and things to be maintained, and the new retired relationship with my husband, we had to figure out how to be together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah, I bet
So there
that
were
was
still some challenges.
Yeah, I can imagine, that affected a lot of married couples during the pandemic because you could not go into work as much. People were isolated together in their homes, and you had to adapt to a new way of life with people not killing each other in their environments.
Right. Well, and now since you mentioned it, yeah, the last week that I worked before I retired, well, that's another thing that the pandemic affected because my husband and I both worked in the Nebraska State Office building in different departments. Our bosses had planned a great big joint retirement party for us with both our departments. And the week before our retirement party, the governor said no gatherings with more than 7 people in the room. And so they had to cancel this retirement party that had been in the works for 3 months. And then they sent me home to work from home for the last week that I worked.
I can imagine that was a big disappointment and had a big effect.
It really
on
was.
everything.
It was very disappointing. But, life goes on. There were people who missed, who had to cancel their weddings and vacations and everything else. So, we weren't alone in that.
Right, and I can relate that there were a lot of negatives. What were some of the positives, though, that came out of the pandemic for you personally?
The positives?
Yes.
Well, I did spend more time on my crafting, playing on my computer, getting to know my husband better again, and spending more time with him. More of the positives were just starting to think more about our health and our future. Being of retirement age and with me immunocompromised, thinking of ways to protect myself, and which has continued to carry on. Washing our hands a lot more and getting into that habit.
Yeah, and with you learning those things, do you have a more understanding of public health and hygiene practices from that?
Oh, yes, I definitely pay more attention to what's going on now, as far as any kinds of illnesses going around and things like that. Such as in January, my husband and I both got norovirus, and that really took us both down quite a bit for a while.
I can imagine. What are your thoughts on the impact of the pandemic on as far as education and learning go?
Well, I think it was tough because I don't think that you get as much attention and how do I want to put this? Children are very the way they learn is very
cognitive,
very much based on their environment,
right?
And having friends and the social interactions and everything at school are very, very important for children. And so I think it had a really negative impact on both the children and the teachers, because the teachers had to find a way to educate the children using the computer instead of, one-on-one learning. That in itself is a challenge because some children just need that eye-to-eye contact. And I know this from having been a teacher in the past. There's a lot more involved than just a school book or a computer screen in learning.
Right.
And there's a lot of emotional and like I said, eye-to-eye contact involved in teaching because every child learns in a different way. And if you don't, if you are in a situation where you cannot cater to the needs of each child, Sure, some's going to be fine with the computer learning and doing it that way. However, scheduling is also a big important of the learning process and classroom teaching. And the children get used to certain schedules, but when you're on a computer and doing these things, that whole routine is broken. And some kids don't do well that way.
Right.
There's a great deal of children who don't do that well that way. So I think it had a negative effect on a lot of the learning. In fact, I know for a fact that one of my granddaughters had a real hard time. She was in high school and having to learn from home, and she had a really, really tough time with doing the classes online and everything else. And I think a big part of that was that lack of social interaction.
Right, I can totally agree, because children do need that social action, especially during young ages, because they learn those social skills and they learn how to navigate in society. Being in a school or a social environment like that. Going back to you working during pandemic, and you was talking about how you were working remotely during that last week. How did the pandemic influence your perspective on the remote work and flexible work arrangements?
I hated it. I absolutely hated it. For one, I'm a social person too, to some degree, and when you work and have worked at a job as long as I did at that one with the state, you have a lot of social interactions with your fellow coworkers, and I missed that. We were all part of DHHS, but we each had different jobs that kind of depended on each other. This person had to get their work done in order for me to get my work done, and my work had to get done in order for somebody else to get their work done.
Right.
And when you're not in the work environment in the same building, it made it very difficult. Plus the fact that I worked with attorneys throughout the state. I was a Medicaid claims investigator, and it made it difficult to communicate with the attorneys that I worked with. It made it difficult to arrange the phone calls from home. More had to be changed to email that we would normally do on the phone. Plus, the system didn't operate the same from my home computer as it did at work. So there were glitches in the system that I had to contend with at home that I hadn't had to contend with at work, in the workplace itself. So I hated it. Plus, I guess I'm like the kids. I need that routine too. And
right.
Sitting at home, you're more tempted to take more breaks, and you're more tempted to, have that TV on when you're working. And
right. It's a very different environment when you are actually at the workplace and when you're doing it remotely. And you stated that you worked for the state of Nebraska, and I know the pandemic affected the country as a whole, and different states dealt with it in other ways. Some states dealt with it worse, other states better. Mm-hmm. How do you feel particularly about how the state of Nebraska dealt with the pandemic? Could they have done better, or do you think they did it in a way to help, I guess, everyone? What are your thoughts on that?
I think they did the best they could. I mean, none of us knew exactly what we were dealing with. It was something new to everybody. And I think they took it very seriously. The week that I retired, the first COVID case hit the state office building. So the way I see it, I got there out of there just in time. Um, Really, no situation would have been ideal under the circumstances.
Right.
And when you're dealing with something that can kill a lot of people, and at that time there was no COVID vaccine, nothing, we didn't know how to avoid it. We didn't even understand entirely how it was being spread. So, it was a lot of guesswork at that point in time. And I think basically everybody did the best they could under the circumstances.
Right. And I had seen a meme the other day, and about Gen X kids, which I'm one of those, and growing up in the 80s. And if we were in the 80s, we were put out when chicken pox came around. Parents put us so everybody could get it, and just get it over with. Do you think if we were kind of in that decade now, if it would have been done the same way with how society has changed over the last 30 years?
I don't really know, because in the case of COVID, there was a lot more death that went with it. Now, not to say that the other diseases weren't dangerous too, because they were. But for example, my aunt died of measles.
Right.
I had measles as a child, and my mother must have been terrified all the time because her sister had died of measles. I went through the measles, the mumps, the chicken pox, all those childhood diseases, whereas you, for example, didn't have to, because there were vaccines available for you.
Right.
Although you did go through measles. We didn't have a measles vaccine when you were born, and you and your siblings did go through measles.
Right. Can you discuss any challenges or opportunities that you experienced in accessing healthcare during the pandemic?
Oh, yeah, it was harder to get doctor's appointments. Anytime before they had the test out there, it was every time you got a sore throat or a cough or somebody sneezed, you worried that they had COVID, or I worried that I had COVID. And the doctors didn't want you coming into the doctor's office. So it was, okay, I have this choice to go and sit in this mile-long lane at the testing sites, when the testing site's in sight, or just sit it out and see.
Right.
See if I felt better tomorrow. So, yeah, it was hard to get into the doctor's office. The doctor was not taking my doctor was not taking a lot of appointments. And then, there was, in fact, even today, there's still the screening, have you had COVID within the last 2 weeks, or have you,
Right.
and all this stuff. Yeah, it was a lot harder to get into the doctor's office when you needed to. My husband had a surgery put off because of it. And
so has that all the pandemic and with the healthcare systems, has that affected your trust in public health and institutions as far as the healthcare system goes?
No, not at all. When it comes to medicine, you got to take the most serious cases first. And when you've got people dying by the droves, you've got to prioritize.
Right.
And you also have to think about the fact that anybody we let into this facility, when we've got this many people with COVID and so many people dying, do we want to let this person who is otherwise healthy, except for maybe, he needs a knee surgery or
Right.
Something like that, do we want to take the risk of them coming in here and getting COVID and dying too?
Absolutely.
So, they had to prioritize, and I think they did a good job of doing that. I just felt really bad for all the nurses and doctors and everything who had to work without adequate protection themselves.
So, what are some of the lessons you've learned about personal resilience and your coping strategies during the pandemic?
Well, I think basically, my coping strategies are real good because I've learned from a lot of life experiences prior to pandemic. But I was in a good place because I don't mind being at home. As I stated before, I've got lots of hobbies, and I won't live long enough to do all the hobbies and the things I'd like to do. And so I was in a pretty good place, but and I forgot the question.
I mean, that's some great answers. And as far as media consumption habits and sources of information during the pandemic, how did those change for you?
They didn't really. I've always watched the news. I've always I've always tried to be aware of what's going on in the world around me. Not only in my own country, but in other countries as well. So that didn't really change. I watched a lot more news and a lot more, when they had anything on the pandemic or whatever, I made a point to listen, so that I could better protect myself and try to protect the rest of my family who didn't always listen.
And so I have one last question for you. And what are your concerns and hopes for the post-pandemic future?
Well, I tell you what, I think we're at a point where to say post-pandemic is, I don't think it's ever going away.
Right.
I think it's here to stay. They're finding other viruses and other strains, other things out there that they can no longer cure just by antibiotics. They've been predicting this was coming for decades.
Right.
And I think it's finally here, and I think we're going to have to learn to deal with it.
Well, I appreciate your time in the interview, Patti, and I wish you a fabulous day.
Well, I wish you the same.
Thank you. And this wraps it up with my interview with Patti Carnes on the pandemic, and I hope all of you have a great day.